Governor Snyder is in Washington as Congress gets an earful about who's to blame in Flint. A presidential election like we've never seen before, and the headlines that we just couldn't pass up this week. Stay put. My Week starts right now.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Welcome to My Week. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Christy McDonald. It has been another week of presidential politics, finger-pointing over the water crisis in Flint, and now brace yourself for a Supreme Court justice fight. All in a week's work. Nolan and Stephen are here tonight with their perspectives on all of that, and we are starting with the hearings in Washington, where there were pointed questions over responsibility and blame. Take a look. While residents are still drinking bottled water in Flint, the question of who is to blame for the catastrophe is being batted around in Washington this week.
Even after the whole world knew that Flint residents were exposed to unimaginable levels of lead, you did not declare a state of emergency until January 2016. Isn't that true?
I took immediate action. As soon as I learned there was a lead issue, we started issuing filters to people, doing water testing, doing blood testing.
Governor
and to be open
Snyder,
with you, I wish more would have been done.
Plausible deniability only works when it's plausible, and I'm not buying that you didn't know about any of this until October 2015.
Governor Rick Snyder testifying in front of the Congressional committee, not only acknowledging mistakes by the state, but pointedly going after federal officials at the Environmental Protection Agency. On Tuesday, it was former Flint Emergency Manager Darnell Early's turn testifying.
We continue to rely on the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And until such time as they deemed the water unsafe to drink, we were doing all that we could to manage the contamination and to also make the water accessible and potable.
For the first time since resigning her post, EPA leader for the Midwest, Susan Hedman, was grilled about why the agency didn't do more when they knew there were high lead levels.
In retrospect, knowing what I know now, I wish we had issued more frequent and more urgent statements.
But it's still your belief and your testimony that you didn't do anything, that the EPA and you didn't do anything wrong in handling the Flint situation.
As I said, I wish we had done more.
You know, you may question the effectiveness of the hearings or what they really answer given the partisan questioning on both sides, but what's happening in Flint does bring the issue of water safety and lead levels to communities across the country. So let's start there tonight with our My Week contributors. Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Hey guys, it's good to see you. And again, you know, we just keep hearing more of the testimony this week in Washington, and as we record our show right now, the governor is testifying as we speak, so we have to put out the disclaimer a little bit. But no, let me start with you. The significance of Governor Snyder sitting down in Washington right now testifying in front of that congressional.
Yeah, I think it's a risky thing. I'm not sure he should have done it. I think he probably had to do it, you know, as he tries to climb out of this hole he's in terms of public trust. I think transparency is important. I think anxious to see how he's received by the panel. I know it's going to be a little shorter session. They're not going to keep him there, you know, hour on end. But this is risky. But he wanted to, you know, he wrote a piece for us this afternoon. That, you know, he wanted to be, you know, to show that he's serious about getting this right. And
he wants to take his digs also at the federal government, at the EPA in particular, knowing full well that the state had a lot of blame in this. But I think by going to Washington, he wants to say, well, it wasn't just us.
Yeah, well, and his story has been, it's not just me. I mean, that's been the sort of frustrating part of this, is that whether it's the EPA or the MDEQ, which he does supervise, or Health and Human Services, he's sort of said, well, all these other people were supposed to do their jobs and they didn't, so, you know, my culpability is somehow diminished by that. And I think that's a very tough sell, given that he is the chief executive, but also given that this is a guy who ran both times for election and as someone who would manage state government better than we had seen before. And so he's got a serious credibility gap right now in terms of you know, promise versus
Does
performance.
this do anything about helping that credibility gap, Nolan?
Well, yeah, I think it's good that he didn't have to go, and it's highly unusual for a sitting governor to be called before Congress or to go before Congress. I mean, there are separation issues, federalism issues, and I think he decided it's better to go than to look like he had something to hide. But if you look at the hearing on Tuesday and then again on today, the central theme running through here is that government failed at every level. A lot of finger pointing on Tuesday. I assume there'll be more finger pointing today as Gina McCarthy from the EPA and the governor testify. They're both sort of like this. Everybody is. But government failed at every level here. Federal, state, local. It is probably the most shocking example of bureaucratic breakdown at every level. Again, no agency sort of picked up and covered for the failure of the next. The state didn't sound the warning. The EPA didn't sound the warning. The local officials were inept and incompetent. There were no heroes here within the government.
So then bottom
Including
line
in the
is,
governor's office, where
including the
this
governor's
was
office,
understood.
but then bottom line is, so we finish with all of these hearings. What do we get out of all of this?
Well, you know, congressional hearings don't have a point generally. It's to allow Congress people the ability to look really angry and like they're doing something on television, and they go on, and there's very little that they can do to the governor. I mean, that's an absolute separation of powers issue. One thing that's interesting this week also is the USA Today has a story out this week about the lead levels in water nationwide.
Right.
Allison Young, who used to be a Free Press reporter, now is a reporter there, has a really great story about putting this all in context. And what's important about that here is two things. One, you know, there is elevated lead levels in lots of communities, but it points up the tragedy here that we were going in the right direction in Flint for a really long time. Lead levels in kids in Flint were lower than they were in most communities, and we had been making a lot of progress in that regard. And this switch from the Detroit water to the Flint River without treating it sent them back up. And so the failure there is again in this dramatic reversal that was totally avoidable, and the fault of bureaucracy that never got its act together to do it the right way.
If you look at Flint and the Flint Water Department, you know, you had seniority bumping. You had a whole lot of people in the water department who used to work in other departments. They weren't experts in their field. I mean, it just really does shine that light on government failure, but it also, I think, and it highlights, and I think one of the reasons the governor wanted to go down to Washington and talk about this is the massive infrastructure need nationwide here. We didn't used to think about lead or anything else in our water, and now every time you turn on the tap, no matter whether you live in Flint or 1,000 miles away, you got to wonder what's coming out of that, because our infrastructure is so old and broken in this country, and we've neglected it. We've spent the money on other things, and now the bill's coming due, and we've got no clue how to pay for that.
And you know, and I think that really is the bigger picture here when you look at these congressional hearings, that people now, and it's taken a while for the Flint story, I think, to get across the nation. And while Flint, there was a perfect storm of so many things that happened all at once there, and a man-made disaster, you could really argue. But I do think it now does raise the question about what is coming out of my tap when I'm living in Massachusetts, or if I'm living in a city in New Jersey who's had historic problems with lead issues, or talking about the training of the people on staff and all of these places around the country. Do we have the right people in places to do the proper testing? Do we actually know what's in our water? And I do think that series that the USA Today put out yesterday afternoon, I'd highly recommend it for people to take a look, that is happening in small towns sometimes that don't have enough personnel or don't have the expertise to do the testing, and it's even happening in larger places. So it does raise this bigger question, but then if we have this bigger conversation of, all right, well, let's take a look at our infrastructure and let's look at how many billions of dollars it would take.
$13 trillion for water systems nationwide. That's the backlog.
And this same thing happened in Washington, D.C. a few years ago without this much attention, without this much fanfare. It's one of the things Mark Edwards, who was involved in that situation, the Virginia Tech professor who's been exposing this, said, the EPA did the same thing in Washington, D.C., a city that's run by the federal government.
Okay, so let's say that coming out of these hearings, maybe there's some larger kind of crackdown at the EPA. Maybe that there's better education for some of the workers there, or you're going to toss a couple of people from there. Does that still, though, is there any kind of political will to start this infrastructure conversation about pipes around the country or not? Or is this, do we sit here and then we say, well, that really is still just kind of Flint and move on?
No, because until there's a crisis, we don't see it. And, there's always something more showy, that you can get more political value out of spending the money on. I mean, the federal government spends an enormous amount of money on a whole lot of things and not nearly enough on infrastructure. And I think we've got to start prioritizing that.
Well, it's not just prioritizing. I mean, there's money that you're going to have to, you're not going to find that money just sitting around doing other things that you're going to stop.
We had $1 trillion spent in 2008 that was supposed to be, stimulus money. It was supposed to be going into these kind of infrastructures projects. Only about 20% went into the nation's infrastructure because they started the pork barreling. They started spreading the money.
It's inefficient. Government is not always efficient, but it is always effective. You did the projects that the projects that got done with that money did what they were supposed to do. The other purpose of that money was to stop us losing 700,000 jobs a month,
and
which
infrastructure
we were
work
at the time,
creates more jobs than anything else, Steve.
Right.
And that's where this money should have gone, and it didn't.
Well, it did.
It went to everybody's some of it did, but not much. It went to everybody's little pet project in Washington. We had money going, just outrageous places. And so, again.
Let's be clear that this was not a water pipe replacement project.
Absolutely.
The stimulus was not.
It
was never.
But in other places, it is. I mean, you've still got lead lines going in every community, perhaps in the communities we live.
Well, I mean, for instance, in Baltimore, they have not been able to drink water, use the tap water in schools for a decade. I mean, that's been going on forever. When I lived in Baltimore, it wasn't just water. The lead paint issue in East Baltimore with old homes that have been demolished, and there's lead dust all over the place. I mean, this is a huge problem in a lot of cities. That doesn't mean that Flint is not the tragedy that we've been making it. It is, but again, the tragedy there is that we had solved that problem, or we were really close to it, and we set ourselves back several years.
And the tragedy is that while we're sitting here today, people are still using bottled water. They are still not able to use their water from the tap. All right, moving on. Tuesday's come and gone, bringing more victories for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Marco Rubio leaves the race, and renewed hope for John Kasich. But it's also leading to bigger conversations of what will happen at the Republican convention, how a Trump candidacy defines or doesn't define the conservative movement. And let's take it a step further, how voter anger and want for change might be better served starting at the state level. So that's like a whole big kind of ball of wax for our political conversation today. But, I want to start off with everything coming out of Tuesday, and you have the Trump dominance. And let me start with you, Nolan, in terms of the conversations that are happening now in the Republican Party about John Kasich's win in Ohio and what that really does or really doesn't do for anything.
Well, what it did was slow Trump down just a little bit, and I think there's a whole lot of people in the Republican Party, that's their goal, to slow Trump down, derail his candidacy. I was out in Grand Rapids earlier this week, and I talked to a few people who, longtime establishment Republicans, party funders, and they're looking toward the convention. I think a lot of people in the party are looking toward the convention as a place to bring some rationality to this race. I think there's a clear understanding if Donald Trump wins the nomination, that's going to destroy the party. And they may end up destroying the party anyway if there's a huge convention fight, but at some point, you've got to bring some rationality to this party.
See, what do you do?
I think when you say rationality or bring rationality to the convention, that makes me smile or laugh, saying no one really knows exactly how that's going to go at the convention. It's going to be far from rational at all.
I think the danger now is appearing to meddle in the democratic process. I mean, the number of votes that have been cast for Donald Trump really make it. What's the
Except
what's
if you
the
don't get
process?
1237, you don't get the nomination.
Okay, so say, all right, let's say if you get like 1,100 votes, and then you've got John Kasich who has 300. How do you make that? How do you make that flip?
It's still not 1237, and I don't think you make that flip. I think if it goes to the convention, it absolutely will not be one of the candidates in the race today. I think they're encouraging these people to stay in the race. So it's not Donald Trump. Donald Trump needs 60% of the remaining delegates to get the nomination. That's not undoable for him. If you look, at the big night he had Tuesday night. Ted Cruz needs something around 70%, and Kasich can't get there. There are not enough delegates left to put him in the nomination. It won't be, if it goes to the convention, unless Donald Trump or Ted Cruz can start wheeling dealing and for delegates, it won't be one of those three.
I think that really misunderstands what is fueling Donald Trump and how fervent that feeling is, how strongly those people feel, and how those people would react. I mean, I think you talk about a floor fight, like literally.
But it might be something you have to do.
And Trump did say he's afraid that there could be some kind of violence if you
he says
take
a
it
lot
to that
of
level.
things, but
he's demagoguing, but he's also not too far off reflecting the people who are supporting him. I mean, these are folks who feel aggrieved in a really significant way. They feel like he's their champion. If you take that from them after he wins more votes than everybody else in this process, I mean, I think you could make 68 in Chicago.
Can you explain how that would work, Nolan? Can you explain how that would work, that if you get to the convention and then all of a sudden you pull Mitt Romney from behind the stage and you say, no, this is the guy, instead of the people that you've been voting on for the past year?
I mean, you put his name in nomination on the second ballot. You're locked in.
Delegates are only locked in on the first ballot.
For one ballot. So unless somebody can wheel and deal enough on the second ballot to get over that, to get past that mark, they don't have the nomination. And I think there's a feeling that a lot of these Trump folks are first-time Republican voters. This is not the core of the party, and that rather than allow Trump to go to November and wreck the party, if there's a chance to stop him at the convention and put up a candidate who can win in November against a very vulnerable Democratic nominee. I mean, Hillary Clinton won on Monday or Tuesday night, but in a lot of races, Bernie Sanders was neck and neck there. I mean, but for a few votes, this could have been a big night for him. There's a lot of dissatisfaction and lack of enthusiasm on the other side.
Meddling in Democratic primaries too.
On both sides.
I mean, in the states where Sanders is closest, you see far more independents registering as Democrats.
I think it's inevitable you're going to alienate a good chunk of voters on both sides of the aisle. These Bernie Sanders people.
She's going to win outright.
She is. But the people who got all fired up about Bernie Sanders and are flooding these primaries are not necessarily going to come back and vote for Hillary Clinton, just like the Trump voters are not likely to stay and vote for the Republican nominee. I think if it's Hillary Clinton and somebody other than Trump, going to have a very low turnout election.
So we were gathering with some friends on Saturday night. We had this larger conversation, and just it kind of to the point that you were making about Bernie Sanders voters or people who are voting for Trump who voted for, getting very passionate about this. And we were talking about how people get so riled up or get so passionate about the presidential election, but yet they've never voted in maybe a local election. They don't know what's going on. They don't know who their state rep is. They don't know who their state senator is. And it was funny that the next day I opened up, Nancy Kaffer wrote this great column in the paper about how maybe people should start to channel some of that passion or the need for change into what's happening locally, that the things that are happening in our state or happening in your own backyard impact you more on a daily basis than perhaps even all of the conversation that we're having on the presidential race.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think anger, though, is sort of the first step of that, right? The people who are attracted to Donald Trump are just, they're just undone about the idea that opportunity doesn't work the way they think it is. They think they will
throw Sanders voters in that same
Sanders voters are in the same category. And the presidential election is their opportunity to sort of channel that right now. Does that translate later into smaller races, more locals? I actually think it might.
It did in 2010. I mean, you look what happened in 2010.
That's true, it did.
And it did in 2006. You
Right.
know, when
When,
the Bush backlash
right.
washed people out, you know, all the way down to dog catcher on the Republican Party.
Right.
The same thing happened in
Right.
2010.
The problem is sustaining it and getting people to a place where they feel like there are actual solutions to the things that are frustrating them. And there aren't. A lot of the people who are angry now
I feel like they have no voice.
were angry in 2006 about the crash of the economy and the fact that the president wasn't doing anything about it, and were angry in 2010 about healthcare reform and all these other things. And the problem is they never find that way
Well, nothing
to
ever
make things
changes.
change because the politicians that they elect don't focus on the actual problem. I mean, they're much more interested in scapegoating than they are in
And in
saying
furthering their own careers.
Last word on
this
this,
is going to be
Nolan.
important in Detroit this fall if the city gets to elect a school board again. I mean, people have to engage, are going to have to pay a
get
lot of
better
attention to
candidates.
candidates. You can't have a school board filled with illiterates and perverts again like we've had in the past. And you know, it's an important election, maybe more important to people of Detroit than the presidential race.
It absolutely
All right, it's time now for some headlines. Yeah, where's our headline music? It was there. It was there.
Didn't
We
hear
have the same conversation every time we run
I
that
never
headline
hear it.
video, too. I think we do.
It's jarring.
So the big conversation this week, the other big headline I think that everyone's got to grab is the Supreme Court and the fact that the president came out with his nominee, and who you said is the nicest guy.
I've never met anyone in Washington who's ever said a bad word about Merrick Garland. No one. Republican, Democrat, everybody really likes this guy. Everyone has immense respect for him. He is a really good judge, been a judge a long time, has worked really well, across the aisle. And in Washington, that is really unusual, right? Everybody has enemies in Washington. I don't know anyone who dislikes Merrick Garland.
Yeah, he's backed Republicans into a corner with this one because Mitch McConnell come right out of the bat with the hard line. We're not going to consider any nominee. And so he sent him an eminently qualified nominee, and one who's 63-year-old, which is very unusual. Usually the presidents want to pick somebody in their early 40s, so they got 40 years of influence. This guy will be around half as long as some of the other picks. He's a moderate.
So do the Republicans look silly on this then?
Well, I don't know if they look silly, but what they have to do is calculate, do they think they're going to win the White House this fall? Because if they think they're not going to win the White House this fall, they better take this guy because they're going to get a lot different kind of appointment from Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton's in office.
If she is president, and if she gets the Senate too, she will go hard left with the pick, partially out of spite. And there's no question that that would be worse for Republicans than.
Yeah, and I
So
think that
how do Republicans get out of it
calculation's
then
being
when they threw down the line like that?
Well, I think you're going to see a lot of these Republicans who, remember, a lot of folks were elected in 2006 from places that weren't necessarily Republican seats generally and are facing re-election this fall. You're going to see a lot of senators putting pressure on McConnell saying, we got to give this guy a hearing. And if, I think it'll wait until the convention, and if they see if Donald Trump is indeed their nominee, I think they're going to be hoisting this guy on their shoulders.
All right.
It'd also be a lame duck move to do it. If they lose the election, for instance, in November, why not then consider the nomination before the new president? I don't support that. I think, look, we've never gone 125 days without a vote on a nominee ever in history. I don't know why anyone is talking about doing that.
Well, they talked about it in 2008 too. Yourself.
Didn't happen.
Yeah, I know, but that had George Bush had an opening in 2008, it wouldn't have gotten filled.
But if I had wings, I'd be a bird.
But it didn't happen.
It doesn't matter.
To invoke this so-called Biden rule, I think is a little disingenuous. It didn't happen, so you can't retaliate for something that didn't happen. But I believe he'll be seated this year.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Happy beginning of the NCAA tournament to you guys too.
High
know
holy
this is your
days.
favorite time. It's your favorite time of year. And that's going to do it for MiWeek. Thanks for joining us. Find us at MiWeek.org on Facebook, Twitter. We appreciate your support for Detroit Public Television. I'm Christy McDonald. Meet us back here next Thursday for MiWeek. Take care.